He believed he was untouchable. Everyone in the small American city of Harbor Glen knew his reputation. Judge Carlton Pierce was, by all accounts, the powerful figure who loomed over the local courthouse like a thundercloud ready to unleash its storm on anyone who dared to cross him. People whispered of bribes, hush money, and conveniently missing court documents that seemed to vanish whenever someone with the right connections needed a favor. Yet, nobody ever openly challenged Judge Pierce. He was a respected official, or at least he projected that facade. In truth, behind the mahogany bench in neatly pressed robes was a man so certain of his own power that he'd forgotten what justice truly meant. Anyone entering his courtroom felt the weight of that unspoken threat. He was the law in Harbor Glen. The press avoided investigating him. Local attorneys dreaded being assigned to his cases, fully aware that if they pushed too hard or uncovered the wrong secrets, their careers might be over. Even the local police department showed deference, preferring to keep a friendly distance rather than risk the havoc that might follow if they got on Pierce's bad side. For 15 years, Judge Pierce had operated in this sphere of influence, growing bolder by the day. They said he kept a safe in his chambers where hush money was hidden, unmarked envelopes stuffed with cash. Some said the safe contained more incriminating secrets. Private recordings, photos, written confessions from desperate souls who had come to him for mercy. Others claimed he had a ledger of all the people who had paid him off or owed him favors. No one outside his tight inner circle had ever seen what was inside that safe, but the rumors made it feel larger than life, a Pandora's box of corruption that fueled the judge's arrogant hold over the city. And then there was a matter of how many lives he ruined through twisted verdicts. A mother wrongfully stripped of custody because her ex-husband was a buddy of Pierce's golf partner. A young defendant sent away for years on a minor drug charge, while the real kingpin in town walked free thanks to a clandestine envelope delivered to the judge's home. Every time justice should have been served, money or political connections often decided otherwise. Harbor Glen's resentment grew like a malignant tumor, pushing a community that once believed in the fairness of American courts into an era of widespread cynicism. Yet nobody spoke out loud. Fear is a powerful silencer. People prayed for a hero or some sort of divine intervention, but cynicism overshadowed hope. They accepted that the local system was broken. Judge Pierce always wins, they would say. Don't bother fighting. It was a reality as fixed as the sunrise in the morning and the hush of midnight. Until one day, everything changed. It started innocently enough. A new face appeared in town. U.S. Attorney Helen McNamara was assigned to investigate potential corruption in the region after multiple anonymous tips reached the Justice Department. Although the tips were vague, whispers of rigged rulings and embezzled funds, something about the consistency of the details piqued the interest of McNamara's boss. Helen was known for her unwavering ethics, sharp legal mind, and an uncompromising sense of justice. She had taken on mobsters, white-collar criminals, and even corrupt mayors in her career. Each time, she proved to be a bulldog, latching onto every trail of evidence until justice was served. But stepping into Harbor Glen, she had no idea how deep the corruption might run. She arrived on a rainy Monday. The sky was shrouded in dark clouds, drenching the courthouse steps in a gray gloom. Helen, clad in a neatly pressed navy suit and carrying a worn leather briefcase, walked through the courthouse doors with purpose. She'd read the rumors. She'd seen the data. Bribes, questionable rulings, sudden financial windfalls. The pattern pointed to something large, something meticulously orchestrated. Her first few days were spent quietly gathering evidence. She observed court proceedings presided over by Judge Pierce. On the surface, it all seemed normal. He asked questions, gave rulings, and maintained the formalities of the judicial process. Yet, Helen sensed an underlying tension. Lawyers who faced him shuffled nervously, responding to his questions with guarded politeness, as though stepping on eggshells. Plaintiff and defendant alike seemed resigned, expecting a certain predetermined outcome. And time after time, Pierce delivered. He dispensed justice with a veneer of legality, but Helen detected a hollowness in his rulings. Her first break came when she decided to talk to the locals, some who had been through Pierce's court, others who had only heard stories. Most were reluctant to speak. A trembling older woman named Gloria Brandt insisted she didn't want trouble. She'd lost her grandson to a prison sentence that seemed far too severe for the minor offense. "Couldn't pay," she muttered tearfully when Helen pressed for details. "His friend's father has money. My grandson didn't." Another man, whose child's medical malpractice suit had been mysteriously dropped, refused to even come to the door when Helen knocked, peering through the window with terror in his eyes. So she left her card, quietly urging him to call her if he ever felt safe enough. On the courthouse steps, Helen confronted a scowling local attorney named Matthias Hughes. For a moment, he refused to speak to her. Then, glancing around nervously, he muttered, "I've seen my share of unusual decisions, but it's not just the verdicts. It's how some files never make it to the docket, or how certain evidence vanishes. I'm not risking my career, my family. You need to leave this town while you can." And with that, he hurried off, head lowered, as though worried security cameras were capturing every second. Helen recognized a look of fear, an almost primal sense that forced people into silence. She had dealt with organized crime families who bred the same kind of intimidation. In the days that followed, she began to systematically trace financial records, donations, rulings, and a string of real estate transactions that might link Pierce to shady deals. The deeper she looked, the more the story spelled out a labyrinth of hidden accounts and questionable associations. What she needed was a crack in the wall, someone who would testify. It wouldn't be enough to have circumstantial evidence or suspicious patterns. She needed a cooperating witness, someone with proof, or at least with direct knowledge of what Pierce had done behind closed doors. She was persistent, showing up at law offices, diners, even local bars, try to coax out details from individuals who might have been complicit, knowingly or unknowingly. Most slammed the door on her or told her to get lost, but her presence was a disruption in the carefully controlled ecosystem of Harbor Glen. And that's when a nameless source, a muffled voice on the other end of a payphone, told her something that made her heart pound. "He keeps everything in a safe in his chambers. If you get the contents of that safe, you'll bring him down." The line disconnected. She couldn't call back, couldn't trace the number, but the tip made sense. If Pierce indeed maintained a stash of blackmail material and bribery ledgers, that would be enough for a federal indictment. The trick was obtaining it legally or compelling someone who had seen it to come forward. She decided to move carefully. The next day, she requested an appointment to speak with Judge Pierce under the pretense of a courtesy visit. He agreed, likely out of curiosity. After all, who was bold enough to request a meeting with him without a reason? She climbed the marble steps to his office, feeling as if she were entering the lair of a lion. Pierce's chambers exuded an ostentatious air, with Persian rugs spread over the floor, tall mahogany bookcases, and a gold-framed portrait of himself wearing his black robe. On a side table sat a heavy clock that clicked loudly in the silence. Pierce rose as Helen entered. A forced smile spread across his face. He was in his early 60s, with meticulously combed mane of silver hair and cold, calculating eyes. He offered his hand, which Helen shook briefly. "U.S. Attorney McNamara," he said with a rich baritone that carried an air of false warmth. "I understand you're new in town." Helen nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I wanted to introduce myself and see if there's anything you think I should know about Harbor Glen's courthouse procedures." He gestured for her to sit. "Our small city is quite traditional," he began. "We adhere to the highest standards of justice." A flicker of amusement played across his lips, as though the words themselves tasted sweetly ironic. "You'll find that we run a tight ship here." She studied him, watching his posture, his eyes, the way he tried to exude confidence. He clearly relished being the dominant figure in any room. The conversation remained politely superficial, a shallow exchange about the nature of the local community, how the judges prided themselves on fairness, how heavy the case load could be. And yet, neither of them believed a word of it. Helen asked a few mild questions, never tipping her hand. She wanted him to think she was just being thorough, nothing more. She departed with a cordial nod, but her mind was churning over the presence of that safe. The judge's eyes had flicked once toward a discreet wooden cabinet behind his desk. She wondered if that was where the alleged trove of secrets might be hidden. In the weeks that followed, the tension around the courthouse rose palpably. The staff gave Helen tight smiles or avoided her entirely. Pierce himself refused any further private meetings, claiming a busy schedule. She began to sense a shift, as though the judge was mobilizing his allies, preparing for some counteroffensive. But Helen pressed on. She reached out to the FBI field office, requesting assistance from an agent who specialized in public corruption cases. Agent Jericho Jerry Morales arrived soon after, an imposing man with quiet demeanor and an impressive track record of rooting out crooked politicians. Together, they followed the paper trail, property deeds, suspicious wire transfers, and unaccounted for revenue that seemed to vanish from city budgets. Still, none of it was enough to build an airtight case. Corruption is notoriously slippery. The best criminals launder their money, hide their footprints, and maintain plausible deniability. Pierce was no different. He used middlemen, shell corporations, and silent transactions. The labyrinth was extensive, and Helen was certain the final puzzle piece lay in that safe. Yet, to get a warrant, she needed more than a mysterious phone call. She needed probable cause and a cooperative witness. That's when, late one night, Helen's phone buzzed. She'd been sitting in her dimly lit hotel room in downtown Harbor Glen, notes and files scattered across the small desk, trying to piece together timelines. She answered on the second ring. It was the same muffled voice from before. "Judge Pierce is planning to make a move," the voice said. "Someone will get hurt. You need to hurry." Helen pressed the phone closer to her ear. "Who is this? Why are you helping me?" A strained pause, and "You ruined my life. I can't talk long. But I have something, documents I took from a safe years ago. Copies. I want to give them to you, but we have to meet in secret. He can't know." Her heart jumped. "Tell me when and where." They arranged a clandestine meeting in a deserted parking lot on the outskirts of town just after midnight. Helen arrived, her car's headlights sweeping across empty asphalt. The drizzle of the light rain flickered against the glow of a lone street lamp. Her hand hovered near her concealed holster, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of an ambush. Finally, a figure appeared, a man in a hooded jacket, face partially obscured by the shadow. He held out a thin manila envelope. Inside, Helen found photocopies of documents, typed statements referencing hush money, bank account numbers, cryptic notes that seemed to indicate sums of cash, and in one case, a short confession from a local official who admitted to bribing Pierce for a lenient sentence on behalf of a relative. Though they weren't original documents, they were an invaluable lead. "Why did you take these?" she asked softly, glancing up at him. He swallowed hard, scanning the parking lot nervously. "I used to be his clerk. I did a few things for him. Stupid things. I didn't want to, but he threatened my family. Said he'd destroy me if I ever talked. I made copies of stuff I found. I thought, maybe someday, maybe there'd be a chance to do the right thing." Helen could see the man's eyes glisten, a mixture of guilt, fear, and relief. "This is the right thing," she assured. "You're helping me build a case that will finally stop him." A crack of thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind picked up. He visibly trembled. Promise you'll protect me." "You have my word," Helen replied. "The federal government has witness protection programs. If you cooperate fully, we'll do everything in our power to keep you safe." He nodded, then jerked his head around at the sound of a passing car on the nearby road. Without another word, he broke into a run, disappearing into darkness. Helen quickly headed back to her car and started the engine. Her thoughts raced. This was enough to get the ball rolling, enough to potentially obtain a warrant for that safe. Still, it was risky. The documents were copies, not originals, and the identity of her source remained uncertain. But she knew the next step would be to present this evidence to a federal judge, untainted by local alliances. The day Helen submitted her affidavit for a search warrant was a tense one. Agent Morales coordinated with her, ensuring that it would remain hush-hush until the moment they executed. They avoided local law enforcement, fearing Pierce's influence might tip him off prematurely. Instead, they brought in an FBI tactical team from another district to ensure no leaks. Before dawn on a Thursday, they pulled up to the courthouse. The parking lot was empty except for a single security guard's car. They knew Pierce would arrive by 8 a.m. for the day's docket. Their warrant allowed them to access his chambers immediately. Their footsteps echoed in the vacant corridors as they marched toward his office, hearts pounding. Helen couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment, someone would swoop in and stop them. Outside Pierce's office, 2 FBI agents picked the lock. The large double doors swung open, revealing the lavish chambers Helen had visited once before. The safe was easy to spot, built into the wall behind an ornate painting of a coastal landscape. Another agent expertly worked the combination. Time felt frozen. If this didn't yield results, if the safe was empty or only contained innocuous items, their entire operation might fall apart. But after a few tense moments, the lock clicked. The door swung open to reveal a trove of folders, documents, and, to Helen's astonishment, stacks of cash bound with rubber bands. As the agents began photographing and inventorying evidence, Helen's breath caught in her throat at one item after another: a ledger with names and dollar amounts, incriminating Polaroids of local officials, a USB drive tucked in a small envelope labeled insurance. She tried to remain calm, but adrenaline surged through her veins. This was it, the mother lode, enough to launch a corruption case that would tear down the entire rotten structure. Suddenly, they heard voices in the hallway. One of the agents moved to intercept, but the door burst open. Judge Pierce stood there, flanked by 2 courthouse security officers. His normally composed face twisted in fury as he realized the safe had been breached. "What do you think you're doing?" he thundered, stepping forward, ignoring the cautionary raised arms of the FBI agents. Helen stepped in front, badge in hand. "Judge Carlton Pierce, we have a lawful warrant to search these chambers. There is evidence here implicating you in bribery, extortion, and conspiracy." She rattled off the charges as her voice steadied. "Please step aside and cooperate." For a moment, it looked like he might physically lash out, but he caught himself. His face grew red, beads of sweat forming along his temple. "You have no right," he snapped. "This is unconstitutional." Agent Morales calmly displayed the paperwork. "Signed by a federal judge in another district, Your Honor. It's all legal." Pierce glared at the security officers, who stepped back uncertain. They, too, recognized that interfering with a federal warrant could be disastrous. The judge let out a disgusted snarl. "You won't get away with this," he threatened. "I have powerful friends." Helen matched his gaze. "We'll see what they can do for you once we present all of this to a grand jury." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Pierce's eyes. But he continued to stand tall, mustering a last shred of his arrogance. "This is all a misunderstanding. You're overstepping. I am the law here." "No," Helen said calmly, every syllable deliberate. "You are not above the law, Judge Pierce." Word spread through Harbor Glen like wildfire. By midday, local news stations were reporting that the federal government had seized evidence from Judge Pierce's chambers. Camera crews camped outside the courthouse. The once fearful locals found themselves torn between disbelief and cautious excitement. For so long, they had suffered under what felt like an unshakable tyranny. Now it seemed that tyranny was cracking. Inside the courthouse, Pierce continued to preside over cases, or tried to, while the wheels of justice turned at the federal level. It was an unprecedented and bizarre scenario. A judge under active investigation, yet still on the bench. But he had allies, people who owed him favors, and they slowed the official process of removing him from duty. Behind closed doors, Helen and Agent Morales worked day and night with the Department of Justice, combing through the seized documents. They found bank records linking Pierce to offshore accounts, letters from local businesses contributing to keep certain suits off the docket, and a veritable blackmail collage of personal secrets belonging to prominent figures in Harbor Glen. The deeper they went, the more they understood the scope of his operation. He wasn't just taking bribes. He was systematically controlling the city from the bench. Helen realized it wasn't only about convicting one man. It was about uprooting a culture of fear and corruption that had infected an entire community. She debriefed the hidden clerk, her confidential source, meticulously documenting every piece of testimony. He named names, city council members, local police officers, wealthy businessmen, who all had deals with Pierce. It was bigger than she had dared imagine. With the mounting evidence, the Department of Justice had no trouble securing an indictment. A special grand jury was convened in a neighboring district, out of reach of any local interference. Tension gripped Harbor Glen. Pierce continued to strut around as though he still owned the place, but those who once trembled at his presence began to avoid him. It was as if they could sense the shifting winds. Finally, the day arrived. Federal marshals entered the courthouse with arrest warrants. They approached Pierce as he stood behind his bench, robe draping his shoulders. The clerk was reading out the next case, but the proceedings were abruptly halted. Helen, standing at the back of the courtroom, watched as the lead marshal stepped forward, announcing the charges: multiple counts of bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness tampering. The judge's face went from shock to rage. He tried to shout, "You can't do this in my courtroom," but the marshals calmly read him his rights. The stunned silence of everyone present reverberated as Pierce was cuffed and led out before the very people he once towered over. The cameras outside flashed incessantly, capturing the humiliating moment. He was no longer the mighty arbiter of justice, but a disgraced official, forced to shuffle past the very reporters he had previously dismissed. The hush that followed among the crowd was electric, heavy with a sense of long-awaited relief. But the story did not end with his arrest. Helen knew all too well that corruption cases often faced formidable legal battles. High-priced defense attorneys, motions to suppress evidence, attempts to discredit witnesses. Pierce would do everything in his power to escape accountability. The trial that followed was as dramatic as any in recent memory for Harbor Glen. National media outlets picked up the story of the corrupt judge who believed himself above the law. In the courtroom, ironically, Pierce now sat at the defense table, a surreal reversal. Gone were his robes. He wore a tailored suit instead, and yet he looked smaller, as though the weight of his predicament had shrunk his once menacing stature. His legal team argued that he was the victim of a federal witch hunt. They claimed the money found in the safe was part of a contingency fund, and that the documents were forged or taken out of context by disloyal former employees. Helen, serving as the lead prosecutor, was relentless. She called witness after witness, people who, emboldened by Pierce's fall, came forward to share their stories of extortion and bribery. The once frightened attorney Matthias Hughes took the stand, describing how Judge Pierce threatened to sabotage his career if he didn't facilitate certain bribes. Gloria Brandt, the grandmother, tearfully recounted how her grandson's sentencing was manipulated to favor a co-defendant whose family had deep pockets. And finally, Helen brought forth the ex-clerk, though frightened and visibly shaking. He provided first-hand accounts of forging court documents on Pierce's orders and delivering envelopes stuffed with cash to the judge's safe. The defense tried to discredit them, painting them as criminals themselves or as unreliable. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, digital records from a USB drive, and the blackmail files that detailed how Pierce strong-armed half the county's leadership. With each new piece of evidence, the walls closed in on Pierce. The jury watched raptly, expressions ranging from shock to outrage. Still, Pierce refused to show remorse. Even as the trial progressed, he remained defiant, giving interviews from jail in which he insisted on his innocence, claiming he was set up by political enemies. He vowed that the truth would prevail. But in the final moments, after weeks of testimony and hours of closing arguments, the jury delivered a verdict: guilty on all major counts. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. In that instant, Pierce's face blanched. Helen observed a man who had built his identity on corruption come to terms with the collapse of everything he once controlled. The sentencing came a month later. The presiding judge, a respected federal jurist from outside Harbor Glen, handed down a lengthy prison term. The expression on Pierce's face as the gavel struck was one of shattered pride. He was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his fate settling over him like the end of a long, sordid chapter. As news of Pierce's downfall spread, Harbor Glen experienced a mixture of shock and renewal. Some of the judge's associates faced their own investigations. The entire local system was shaken, forcing a reckoning among its officials. A wave of local reform swept in, with state and federal oversight committees, ensuring that such corruption would not taint the bench again. On the day Helen prepared to leave Harbor Glen, she took a moment to reflect on the steps of the courthouse, those same steps she had climbed with trepidation months earlier. Now, they felt different, imbued with a sense of hope. Reporters gathered, microphones extended, eager for her final statement. She cleared her throat, focusing on the camera lenses pointed at her. "This case proves that no one is above the law," she said, her voice clear. "Justice is not a privilege reserved for those with money or connections. It belongs to everyone. Today, the people of Harbor Glen can believe in that truth again." A thunderous applause broke out, and for once, the city's applause was genuine. She stepped away, a feeling of satisfaction washing over her. Her phone buzzed with messages from the Justice Department, colleagues congratulating her, and from her confidential source, who had entered a witness protection program. He simply wrote, "Thank you for giving me a chance to do the right thing." For a long moment, she just stood there, letting the cheers fade behind her, letting the crisp breeze carry away the lingering memories of Pierce's tyranny. In the stillness, she felt not only triumph, but a profound humility that comes from knowing how many lives have been affected and how many now had a second chance. She hoped Harbor Glen would use this moment to rebuild trust, to learn from its mistakes, and to never again let fear overshadow justice. As she walked down those courthouse steps for the last time, Helen McNamara knew this victory belonged not to one individual or even one agency, but to the enduring principle that in America's system of justice, even the most corrupt can and will be held accountable. And that truth, echoing to the corridors of Harbor Glen and beyond, was the best possible ending to a story of darkness finally conquered by the light of true justice.